What's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look at the Vancouver Canucks, and this is going to be a little bit more of an in-depth video on, we've been talking a lot about recently the whole situation around Bo Horvat and Brock Besser, and those are videos that are going to be coming here over the next couple of weeks, and JT Miller and everything else that's gone on in Vancouver. But what is the root of the problem in Vancouver? And this is something that I'm sure a lot of you guys do know about, but a lot of you might not. And I think that's something that we need to discuss, and we're going to do that in today's video. So shout out to some of my guys that commented on my most recent Canucks video, and we're going to be looking at the comments in this one, and this was sort of the inspiration for this entire video idea. So shout out to you guys, and guys, same thing in this video. If you guys maybe want a chance at a shout out in one of my videos, I do read your guys' comments and I do post it here on the channel, some of those comments, as inspiration for other videos in the future. So the first one, of course, we're going to Ali Dej. And of course, his first one here is Vancouver has been spinning their tires in mediocrity for like 10 plus years. And we're going to get into that. Not getting any better, not getting any worse. And again, we will also be getting into that. I love Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes, but other than that, there's not a whole lot to be excited about. Horvat is supposed to get traded. Again, we're going to get to that as well. Miller is supposed to get traded. Besser is a question mark. They've got some bad contracts, and he also put an edit. He said, I suppose like Karamaki and Podkolzin still have a chance to be good. And we will get to that as well. And then Jack Long, before we get to Joe Pratt, Jack Long says the Miller extension was a very high-risk, ill-advised move for the Canucks, given the excessive amount and term. This player has now become very difficult to move elsewhere, something that would very much be in the Canucks' interest, given the emergence of Bo Horvat. Now it may be that Horvat is overachieving this year and will be unlikely to repeat these numbers. Nevertheless, when you factor in other intangibles besides point production like leadership, maturity, temperament, turnovers, and likability, Bo Horvat is the clear choice over JT Miller. We will go over that as well. In the last 3 games, Miller has been very solid, both producing points and not turning over the puck. The bottom of the line, JT Miller is a good, decent point producer who can outscore all his flaws when he's on his game, but he is not a franchise player, yet the Canucks pay him as if he is that franchise player. Whether or not Bo Horvat is a franchise player is up for debate, but he is closer to being a franchise player than JT Miller is. He is 2 years younger on top of that. And then, of course, Joe Pratt to end this one. In my opinion, the real problem in Vancouver is that Canuck owners simply don't want a rebuild. Again, going to be a key point in this video as well. The new management group says they have complete control of running this team, but they are saying the same things the group said. No rebuild, just change a couple of players and go from there. Trouble is, Canucks need cap space to build a successful team, and that means some big contracts have to be moved. Horvat or Miller or Myers or Oliver Ekman-Larsson or Besser or Garland. Moving on from Pearson and Pullman will help, but in my opinion, not enough. So obviously, shout out to all those guys, Ali Dej, Jack Long, Joe Pratt, and Urban Champ, who recently changed his name to Urban, but shout out to you guys. But now we have to get to the root of the video, because now, based off of what you guys have been saying, there's a little bit here. And of course, recently, this was back right before, a lot of holiday cheer in Vancouver ahead of the holiday season. This was an article by Rob Williams of Offside back December 20th of 2022. The article starts, Canucks fans chant, "Sell the team," during last home ice debacle. The Vancouver Canucks have tried firing the general manager. They've tried firing the coach. Now it seems fans want the owner fired. Fire betting chants have been replaced by "Sell the team" for disgruntled fans at Rogers Arena. Monday wasn't the first time fans have chanted it, but it may have been the loudest. It was even audible on the television broadcast. The Canucks lost 5-1 to the St. Louis Blues at Rogers Arena. It was the second straight home game. The Canucks fans were treated to a 5-1 loss. Remarkably, the Canucks have lost a third of their 15 home games by a 5-1 score. Vancouver has the third worst home record in the entire National Hockey League with a woeful 5-9-1 record. Needless to say, fans have had enough. On Saturday, another Canucks fan tossed a jersey on the ice in protest. Multiple jerseys were tossed during the home opener as well. No jerseys found their way onto the ice on Monday against the St. Louis Blues, but perhaps that says more about Rogers Arena security efforts than the mood of the fan base. This was someone that was at the game saying that basically fans that were walking down in the lower bowl with a jersey in their hand with the intention to throw their jersey on the ice, security was already onto those people, not allowing them to throw the jerseys onto the ice. And then obviously with that we hear the sell the team chants. It was a clear shot at Canucks ownership. The Canucks have been seemingly reluctant to do what it takes to rebuild this team in a meaningful way for most of the last decade. Francesco Aquilini has been criticized for being too impatient and too driven to push for the postseason. Despite trading away draft picks and other short-term thinking moves, the Canucks have still missed the playoffs in 7 of their last 9 seasons, and they're trending toward missing the postseason again here in 2023. Only 5 teams have a worse record than the Canucks since the start of the 2015-16 season, including the expansion Seattle Kraken. But even Seattle is already better than the Canucks this season in just their second year in the National Hockey League. The expansion Seattle Kraken are already looking like a potential playoff contender. But even Seattle is already better than the Canucks this season in just their second year in the NHL. The Kraken are currently a couple of points ahead of Vancouver in the standings. Canucks fans are practically begging for some semblance of a plan they can believe in going forward because the current collection of players isn't inspiring confidence. And then there's a bunch of memes of Francesco Aquilini, Jim Rutherford taking a lot of heat. Oh man, they even went to Scooby-Doo. Wow. Of course, the dumpster fire memes coming out. Yeah, things have been rough in Vancouver. And this is all recent stuff. Of course, the Canucks are a fan base that is known for being very passionate and a rabid fan base, and sometimes it's too, it's an advantage for them, and sometimes it's a detriment because the problem is these fans have a very good pulse of this group. And when things come out in terms of potential divide in the locker room, which we were hearing as soon as last season, and just the overall picture of ownership and this and that, there are certain cities you can get away with that a little bit. Vancouver is not one of them. And you guys, listen, when I post videos, I hear the good and the bad, and I appreciate that because you guys are a very passionate fan base, and I appreciate every single one of you coming out because, listen, it is a very frustrated fan base, and I understand the frustration and why you guys get upset in the comments and things like that because the team has not been good. You want some ugly stats. I mean, this is a team, and I love to go back to the 2011 Stanley Cup Finals, right? That run that they went on where they ultimately lost to the Boston Bruins. Since then, in 11 seasons, they have made 4 playoff appearances, so they've had 4 playoff seasons. Their most successful season was the 2020 season during the pandemic where they went to the Western, I guess you would call it, the Western Conference Finals where they inevitably lost to the Dallas Stars. And that is the only year in 2021 they won 2 playoff series in the last 11 years, and that was in that same 2021 season. So in 10 of their 11 seasons, they have not even won a playoff series. So that's kind of where the Canucks are at. Now we're going to get into what has led to this point over the last over a decade now of Vancouver Canucks inadequacies, incompetencies. What is the root of the problem? So that takes us to Francesco Aquilini, the owner of the Vancouver Canucks. And Aquilini is known for being a general manager that lacks patience. And that is something that, especially in the sports world, specifically hockey, you can't necessarily buy your way to a Stanley Cup, especially with the salary cap and things like that. You get away with that a little bit in baseball and definitely basketball. Not so much in hockey. And the Canucks have been one of the victims of that. They've gotten some pretty big name free agents. They've overpaid for plenty of guys. And it hasn't worked out for them in any real degree. Now this takes us back to one of the roots of the problem, and that is the Trevor Linden saga. Now, if you guys don't know, Trevor Linden was obviously a huge figure for the Vancouver Canucks in the late 90s, and I believe he played in the early 2000s. Either way, he played in the 90s. He was a key player for the Canucks and was a guy that was a pretty important figure for the Vancouver Canucks franchise for many years, worked his way up to a very high role in the Canucks management team. And it eventually got to a point where this was an article from 2018. Mike Johnston of Sportsnet back in 2018. Moments after the Vancouver Canucks made the surprise announcement that Trevor Linden was leaving the franchise, team owner Francesco Aquilini took to Twitter to send out a personal message. Linden had spent the past 4 seasons serving as the team's president of hockey operations. And although the Canucks didn't fare too well on the ice during that time, the 48-year-old was lauded for the work he's done to rebuild the team on the fly. This is the quote from said Francesco Aquilini. I deeply value everything Trevor has done for this city and this franchise, Aquilini wrote as part of a 12-tweet thread. He's tremendously popular in Vancouver, and for good reason. I thank him for helping us to get to this point, and I wish him nothing but the best in his future endeavors. In addition to Aquilini praising Linden and announcing that Canucks general manager Jim Benning will now be tasked with heading up the team's hockey operations department, he also took a trip down memory lane. I'm a diehard Canucks fan as well as an owner. I love this city and this team. An interview at a business magazine recently asked me if I had any unfulfilled dreams, and I said just one. I want to bring the Stanley Cup to Vancouver. I grew up not far from Pacific Coliseum, back where the Canucks played, and basically going on. And that's not really the point of the video. There was a divide in the locker room and more specifically in management back in 2018. And this was before the Canucks went on that 2021 or that 2020 Stanley Cup run. And at the time, you have to remember where the Canucks were at. This was a changing of the guard in Vancouver as we started to see the emergence in the rookie seasons of Elias Pettersson, Brock Besser, and inevitably they would be drafting Quinn Hughes just a few years later. So the Canucks were starting to get into a new direction as the Sedins were in their final days in Vancouver. Burroughs, Edler, all those guys, the old guard of Vancouver, Yannick Hansen, all those guys were on their way out the door. Kevin Bieksa, Dan Ham, you go down the list, okay? And the Canucks had to make a critical decision at that point. And that decision was, are we going to rebuild this team and continue the process of developing prospects and draft picks and continuing to stockpile depth, or are we going to go for it right now? And it was at a point where the Canucks had a couple of seasons where they showed a lot of promise, but there just wasn't enough there. And you have to look at where the Canucks were at. Now, at that time, now it had been, again, that 2017-18 season was now the 3rd consecutive season the Canucks had missed the postseason. So there was already a little bit of angst in Vancouver. Like, shit, we haven't sold playoff tickets since 2015, where they got bounced in 6 games against a big geographical divisional rival in the Calgary Flames. And before that, it had been within a 5-year span, they had only made the playoffs once, which was that 2015 season. So there was definitely a little bit of angst and a little bit of a hot seat for Trevor Linden. And Linden said, no, we need to double down on this rebuild. We need to continue to stockpile draft picks and prospects. We aren't there yet. And Aquilini said, listen, we can't keep rebuilding this team forever. And I want to bring a cup back here. Listen, I only have so much time left here as an owner. I want this team to win. We need to double down on winning. And what did the Canucks do? Well, they sided with Jim Benning. Jim Benning was the more, let's go for it, let's pick up the big free agents, and let's get this thing going as soon as possible. We've got the core developing. We've got the Elias Petterssons. We've got the Hugheses. We got Demko. We have these guys around. Now we just need to add the veteran pieces on the back end and up front to put us over the edge and make us that Stanley Cup contender. And that was the move that Aquilini decided to go with because, yeah, of course, it fits the narrative of we want to start to get back to the playoffs and we are done with the rebuild. Well, they never really committed to the rebuild, and that was part of the problem. We're seeing that as a problem here today. In the beginning of 2023, the decisions that were made back in 2018, coming back to bite the Vancouver Canucks in the rear end 5 years after Trevor Linden was taken out of this organization. So we obviously saw, again, another 2 seasons, 2018, 2019, where this team struggled. And finally, those benefits started to pay off from the Benning-Aquilini move in 2020. But there was a lot of questions even back then. Hey, listen, is this sustainable? And in 2020, they went to the Western Conference Final. It looked like they had a real chance to maybe get something done. Oh, excuse me. They won 2 rounds. They won the qualifying round and the first round. They ended up losing in the actual second round of the playoffs against the Golden Knights, who inevitably lost to the Montreal Canadiens, right? So it was a rough stretch for them, right? Or the Dallas Stars. I think it was Dallas in 2020. That's right. And then they proceeded to miss the playoffs in 2021 and now 2022. And that inevitably in 2022 was the nail in the coffin for Jim Benning. So that didn't work. Now they lost Trevor Linden and what his philosophy was, and it kind of proved him right. Yeah, okay, we could have 1 year of good success, which they did, but there's no sustainability there. There's no Penguins making the playoffs 15 of 16 seasons under Crosby, in the Crosby and Malkin era. That is sustainable success. 3 Stanley Cups. You look at the Blackhawks, very similar dynasty. Yeah, okay, it's not 3 straight cups in a row, but it's sustained success for a decade with a core 3 or 4 players. Vancouver didn't have that. And there was no real sense that that was really attainable in Vancouver, even at the time. And then, like I said, Jim Benning doubled down on his final year in Vancouver, making that go-for-it-now move, trading out a first-round pick for JT Miller, which actually looked good at the time, right? But then the contract, which we have to still get to. Then we get to the point where the Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Connor Garland trade, right? You gave up Dylan Guenther, who was going to be a very good prospect, and it was the Golden Goal winner in Canada this year for Canada to bring back gold. He was destined to go to Vancouver. They traded him out, right? They traded that draft pick, which Arizona ultimately drafted Dylan Guenther with. That's going to come back to bite them. And now who do they have? They have these saggy old contracts of Connor Garland and Oliver Ekman-Larsson to show for it. That hurts. And, when you really look at it, those are basically untradeable contracts where if today the Coyotes decided they wanted Dylan Guenther to get moved, they could get a very nice package for Dylan Guenther today. So, again, yeah, at the time, Jim Benning knew that, but didn't realize how precipitously the value of Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Garland would go down. And that is the salary cap era today. You need guys on entry-level contracts, which they would have had in Guenther for at least 3 years. And they decided to go with the older veterans who were injury-prone. And look where that got the Canucks. 2 anchor contracts. While Guenther is going to produce and be a very good potentially this spring playing his first games in the National Hockey League with the Coyotes, or going back. I think he played for the Coyotes a little bit earlier this year and got sent back to the juniors. he will be back in Arizona, I can assure you. Whether it's the end of this season or the beginning of next year, I can assure you his future is a lot brighter than Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Connor Garland moving forward. That's only the start of this whole thing, right? That is one of the many decisions that Jim Benning made in his time after Trevor Linden. And of course, the other one, which is now almost more concerning, is the more recent drama around JT Miller and Bo Horvat. Now, Bo Horvat, you could argue that both of these players, very good players, right? JT Miller coming off of a 100-point plus season last year. And the Canucks were fielding offers for him in the summer. They decided to not trade him. Apparently there was one on the table with the Islanders, and the Islanders at the last minute said, no, we're not going to do it. But they were very, very close to trading Miller to the Islanders, and how different things could have been looking back. And as an Islander fan, I'm quite happy the Islanders stayed away from that. But that is something that was on the table at one point. Now, the Canucks end up, during training camp out of nowhere, deciding they were going to sign him long term. And some Canucks fans were excited and optimistic, and others were like, oh, what did we just put ourselves into? And I think they're seeing the ramifications of that now, because nobody considered how good of a season potentially Bo Horvat could have this year. And the season JT Miller had last year, we're looking at potentially similar numbers here for Bo Horvat, who is 2 years younger and yet to sign that big ticket, potentially on the table for the Canucks. And now the Canucks are potentially in danger of losing their captain, who is Bo Horvat, potentially for nothing if they don't trade him before this year's trade deadline, which means they have no leverage going into the trade deadline this spring, which is all the more concerning. So this is a real interesting scenario, and even, the Canucks locker room is actually, we've heard stuff come out saying they were kind of surprised that, that the Canucks had kind of doubled down on JT Miller and decided to not sign Horvat first and make Horvat the priority. Considering he is the captain of the team, and the fact he is a little bit younger and has more upside and potential than Miller. Again, that's a lack of foresight, and again, the management maybe putting their eggs in a basket that they maybe did too prematurely in JT Miller, right? And again, this comes to some of the key concepts I want to discuss. Now, the other thing we have to discuss is, this is kind of concerning, and this was earlier in December of 2022. And I'm sure you guys remember Mikey DiPietro. Former Vancouver Canucks prospect Mikey DiPietro happy with his new start. After a significantly challenging start to his career with the Canucks organization, Michael DiPietro is reinvigorated his career with the Bruins affiliate, the Maine Mariners. It was a loaded question for DiPietro, but after a well-documented stay with the Canucks that presented challenges on more than one occasion, it seemed only fair to ask the 23-year-old goaltender felt a sense of relief about an early season trade that sent him to the Bruins organization, one that ultimately sent him to the ECHL's Maine Mariners. I don't want to say it was relief. There's no need to hash out the past or anything. Vancouver is an organization that gave me an opportunity and believed in me on draft day all the way back in 2017. As time goes on, business happens, and at the end of the day, sometimes things don't work out for one side or the other, and you move on. DiPietro says he still keeps in touch with his now former Canucks teammates and took the high road at every possible turn, expressing gratitude for his new opportunity with Boston while being appreciative of what he accomplished in Vancouver. So really what this is about, DiPietro was not going to have the success he wanted in Vancouver. And is that a lack of DiPietro? Or is that the lack of development by the Vancouver Canucks management and coaching? I think it's that one. Now, to be fair, I don't really think there was a spot for him in Vancouver. You thought about Thatcher Demko, like that was really the guy they were going to go with long term. And there's even rumors he could get traded, but I still think Thatcher Demko is your guy. And Spencer Martin has looked very promising at points this season. So I don't think they're necessarily upset about the loss of DiPietro right now. But when you trade a former first round pick or very early on draft pick goaltender at 23 years old, there's always that concern that that will come back to bite you. I mean, look at Jordan Binnington. It took him till he was 25, 26 years old to become the goaltender that won a Stanley Cup in St. Louis in 2019. Right? Goaltenders take a little while to develop. And did Vancouver bail out on Michael DiPietro too early? And that's still to be determined, but there's always that sense. And then there's the other concern about other players, right? Other guys that they've maybe let get out of their pipeline too soon, right? Jacob Markstrom, look what he's become since he left Vancouver. Vezina candidate goaltender, this and that. And again, that's all fine and dandy. And again, what were the chances he was going to develop that way in Vancouver? And again, you had Thatcher Demko. And I understand at the time why it made sense, but look at Chris Tanev. Chris Tanev had an unbelievable first season after leaving Vancouver, and he's kind of regressed a little bit, but he's still a good defenseman. But what did Vancouver invest in? Instead, they invested in Connor Garland and Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who you could argue that Markstrom and Tanev are probably better, cheaper options than the aforementioned guys that ended up going to Vancouver. So some of the choices that the Canucks have made, and it's come back to bite them at points. And, when you want to talk about the key talking points, the key thing I look at here is avoiding the R word. And no, not that word. The R word is the rebuild. And the Canucks are not the only team to fault this. The playoff revenue is a very sexy thing to a owner. That is something that is very attractive and something that a lot of ownership teams cannot deny. Listen, playoff revenue, that's another potentially 3, 4, even, if they make it past the first round, 5 or 6 games. Home game attendance numbers, I mean, each game brings a lot of money. And you add potentially 3 to potentially even a dozen new playoff games each year, that's a huge benefit for that franchise. And that's something that the Canucks have kind of made a really big point, yet it's kind of been counterintuitive because the more they've dumped into this team, the less successful they've actually been, right? And just not waiting that extra year or two of a rebuild to just push it to get just to the playoffs this spring. It never ends up working for the Canucks. Like I said, they're struggling to develop some of their talent. The Linden controversy, kind of doubling down on, listen, we are done with the rebuild. We're done with trusting the process. We need to win now. And that hasn't worked out for the Canucks. Obviously, the selling the team chance continues to drive home that point. The throwing the jerseys on the ice, that is not something that is only a Vancouver thing, but it's definitely a reason for concern. The divide in the locker room between, we heard this stuff as soon as last year, the younger group and then the JT Miller-led group, JT Miller being even called a prick from his own teammates. I mean, this is stuff that you don't really want to hear about in the public. And again, that's maybe the lack of leadership, the lack of Kevin Bieksa or Edler or Hamuse or the Sedins or Burroughs, the lack of that true veteran grizzled leadership has led to this sort of stuff and this kind of toxic nature in the locker room. And when you bring in guys that are big ticket guys that think they're all that, never get put in place like a JT Miller, well, this is where these things start to happen. The lack of foresight, the Tyler Myers contract, the Oliver Ekman-Larsson trade, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's really been a problem for the Canucks. And then, of course, the playoff revenue stuff. The lack of foresight has really killed the Canucks and been a true issue for this team. And this is not a slander. Like I said, Francesco Aquilini, I don't think is going out of his way for this devious plan to ruin the Canucks. He wants to bring a Stanley Cup to Vancouver. But the problem is, we've seen this with other owners like Eugene Melnyk, and rest his soul. Of course, a great man in the community of Ottawa, and he had best intentions. But when you have an owner that is almost too much in terms of decision-making and not letting the GM do what they need to do, sometimes they get in the way of what's best for the team. And I think ultimately that's been the problem in Vancouver, and they are one of the newest victims of that. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you guys think of the Vancouver Canucks? Do you guys agree with some of these talking points? I think this is a team that has so much potential with Quinn Hughes, with Elias Pettersson, with Besser. I mean, even the younger guys like Vasily Podkolzin, like Lekaramaki. I mean, these are good prospects, but can they develop them? Can they just let them trust the process? And can they get rid of the cancers in the locker room? You know, because I think moving JT Miller is going to be very difficult now. And what last summer looked like they could get a nice package potentially from the Islanders or the Rangers or the Penguins or the Bruins or some of those teams on the East Coast, all of a sudden it looks like it might be almost more of a, you know, give us multiple first round picks to take his contract. And I'm sure that's not something that Jim Rutherford would have been thinking just 6 months ago when he signed that contract. Guys, let me know what you think down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again next time.